And in this second lecture, of course, we are going to start with the first topic that we have to cover is basically sources, right? This is the first topic of our ancient India, that is sources, right? So before I come to the sources, let me make you understand why the sources are very important. And in fact, before understanding any part of history, we have to definitely understand sources, because how the sources are very important and what is the significance of the source, that I'll definitely try to discuss but I'll be coming to them one by one. But before I come to sources, let me tell you very frankly that there is another question. I'll partially discuss about this and I won't go into much detail. That of course we have been studying the sources of what? The sources of history, right? So when it comes to the sources of history, so before I come to the sources directly, let me make you understand one thing, that what is history? That's a very important question. And why it is so important question? Because the moment it comes to understanding history as a discipline, as a subject, you have to be very careful that it is not a subject, not a discipline whose meaning or which the meaning of history does not remain same. Rather, I can tell you one thing, that the meaning itself is going through a sort of transformation, and probably that creates the problem, because what sort of an understanding or the perception that we do have for history right now, it's not necessary that the same sort of perception was there since the beginning or since the ancient times. Now the problem is this, what is the most significant thing that you have to keep in mind, that when it comes to the understanding of history, sometimes we try to understand it with the same old perception, and that's why we are not able to understand what is the exact requirement in the current scenario from the history, from this particular subject, and we try to apply the same older thing. Such as, you all must have heard one thing, that history is basically the study of some great leaders and all, right? This is, and in fact this is what we have been doing even right now also, because the moment I say history, so in your mind the ideas which are flowing are the ideas which are coming. So you always think of Ashok, you always think of Akbar or Chandragupta Maurya and so on, right? Alexander. So these are the names coming in your mind, but then it is a wrong perception, right? When it comes to the subject, which is called as history, it is gradually evolving. And I must tell you that in last 2500 years, there are different meanings of history that has been shared with us so far. But then we commit that mistake, that we follow the same older perception for the history even right now. Do you remember one person who is considered as father of history? Herodotus, right? And what was the definition of Herodotus of history? आपको याद भी है कि हेरोडेटस ने हिस्ट्री के उनका परसेप्शन क्या था? Study of? No, he doesn't talk about study of great personality. He simply said, Herodotus is saying, what is history? Basically, we need to collect, right? We need to collect our memories, or let's say our past, in order to convey it to our future generation. Okay? So he doesn't talk much about history, what should be collected. That is the most important question. He doesn't talk about that. He's saying कि हमारी जो memories है, उन memories को हम collect करके रखते हैं, क्योंकि future के generation को उसके बारे में पता चलना चाहिए. That is the oldest definition of history which is coming. But then yes, it is also true that he was the first person who tried to define what is history. Over the period, you can find that the people have started giving some new definition. There is another person. This is not very important to be noted as such. आपको क्या करना है, थोड़ा आपको अपने माइंड में ये समझना है कि कैसे हिस्ट्री के परसेप्शंस बदल रहे हैं और आजकल कैसे नए परसेप्शन है. There was a person that's called as Plutarch. ठीक है, I think you might have heard the name of Plutarch. Plutarch हिस्ट्री को कैसे डिफाइन करते हैं? वो कहते हैं कि हिस्ट्री इज बेसिकली a discipline which studies the great personalities and the leaders. And Plutarch's definition is so much so much applicable in the present times. It is our misconception, it is a misnomer, but still somehow we understand the history with the same perception. History is nothing but the study of some great leaders and personalities, or let's say invaders. He had used this particular term invaders, though it is not correct. So Plutarch has defined it in a very different way. And as I did tell you, that how come the Plutarch's understanding of history is still very influential, because when you start reading history, most of the time 99% people believe that history is like this. जब भी आप किसी से पूछते हैं कि जो है, आप कोई आपसे पूछता है कि क्या कर रहे हो, आप कहें मैं यूपीएससी की तैयारी कर रहा हूँ, है ना? तो अगर कोई जानने वाला होगा तो पूछेगा कि कौन सा ऑप्शनल लिया है उसके लिए, आप बोलेंगे हिस्ट्री ऑप्शनल, तो सबसे पहले गलती कर दिया आपने. ठीक है, ये पहला रिएक्शन आता है. ठीक है, फिर पूछेंगे कि अच्छा हिस्ट्री पढ़ते हो, आप कहेंगे हाँ पढ़ता हूँ या पढ़ती हूँ. तो उनका रिएक्शन, अच्छा बताओ औरंगजेब की डेथ कब हुई थी? एम आई करेक्ट or not? पानीपत की पहली लड़ाई कब हुई थी, पानीपत की दूसरी लड़ाई कब हुई थी, मतलब उनको ना फैक्ट्स या पर्सनालिटीज के ऊपर बेस्ड होकर हिस्ट्री समझने की आदत हो गई। ये प्लूटार्क का आइडिया था और प्लूटार्क बहुत पुराने हैं जिन्होंने इस तरीके से हिस्ट्री को डिफाइन किया। सो दैट्स द रीजन बिकॉज ऑफ व्हाट आई एम सेइंग कि हिस्ट्री इज इवॉल्विंग, बट देन दिस अंडरस्टैंडिंग लाइक itself is not completed. There is one great person, scholar of history, that person is called as Arnold Toynbee. ठीक है, I think you must not have heard the name of Arnold Toynbee. Now this person has really played a very significant role when it comes to understanding of history. इसके बारे में मैं थोड़ी सी बात करूंगा that you can understand कि how come our perception for the history started changing. टोइनबी क्या कहते हैं? टोइनबी कहते हैं कि हिस्ट्री इज नॉट merely the study of basically like history is not merely the study of basically some great personality, rather like he writes or he says that history is the understanding of what? The understanding of changes, and the changes which were driven by what? Challenges. Now I think we are coming a bit closer to the right definition of history. We are not supposed to read only about Chandragupta Maurya, Ashok, and then Akbar and so on, or Mahatma Gandhi. In fact, like we have to understand the challenges. Now this is very like deep concept what he is talking about. So he talks about two different kind of challenges. Challenges to what? Let's say this is a society. This is a society. Now what happened? The society is facing challenges, and do you know what kind of challenges I am talking about? There are two different kind of challenges which are like which are discussed by Toynbee. One, he talks about internal challenges, and the second he talks about outer or external challenges. So he talks about two different kind of challenges being faced by the society, and he does not talk only about the challenges, rather he says that when it comes to these two challenges, how come the society, right, how come the society is reacting? This is what called as history by him. Now how many of you can understand this idea of internal and external challenges? What do you understand by this term, internal and external challenges? What is internal? External challenge, I think it's not very tough to understand. Invaders, ठीक है, बहुत आसान है समझना कि क्योंकि कोई भी इन्वेडर अगर आएगा तो जाहिर सी बात है चेंजेस तो होंगे, and that's the reason because of what we still discuss this particular point कि what are the impacts of the Alexander's invasion to India, what were the impacts of the Babur's invasion to India, or let's say anybody else, right? So external challenge is very simple to very simple to understand, but then how do you decode the internal challenge in history? Political instability, sorry, मे बी कुछ भी हो सकता है। इंटरनल चैलेंजेस बहुत सारे हो सकते हैं, ठीक है। आप सिर्फ पॉलिटिकल टर्म्स में आप देख रहे हैं, क्यों आप पॉलिटिकल टर्म्स में देख रहे हैं या इस तरीके से आप देख रहे हैं? क्योंकि आप शायद अभी उतनी बेहतर तरीके से हिस्ट्री नहीं समझ रहे, बट लेकिन आप एक बात समझिए कि इंटरनल चैलेंजेस बहुत हो सकते हैं। मान लीजिए, लेट्स से इफ यू सी और इफ यू टॉक अबाउट द एवोल्यूशन ऑफ वर्ना, राइट, इट मस्ट बी रिएक्शन टू समथिंग, right? And do you really believe कि it is a response of the society to any external challenge? No, it was a response to some internal challenge which was coming. Of course they had faced certain challenges. आपको क्या लगता है जब society में कुछ changes आ रहे हैं, and I'll come to that particular point also, that how come the changes are very important in history. So the moment you talk about the changes, of course the change is coming in order to cope up with something. There are certain challenges, right? And how to cope up with this challenge? The society is showing certain responses to this, like they are reacting. So basically he talks about two different kind of challenges, internal and external. External बहुत आसान है समझना, internal कुछ भी हो सकता है। उनको जो है शायद अपने प्रोडक्शन को सिक्योर करना है, उनको लगा कि इस प्रोडक्शन को सिक्योर करने के लिए कुछ ना कुछ तरीके होने चाहिए। उन्होंने क्या किया? उन्होंने एक वर्ना सिस्टम बनाया। दिस इज वन इंटरप्रिटेशन आई एम टेलिंग यू, बट आई एम जस्ट थ्रू दैट इंटरप्रिटेशन आई एम ट्राइंग टू मेक यू अंडरस्टैंड दैट हाउ कम द इंटरनल चैलेंजेस कुड ऑल्सो ब्रिंग सर्टन चेंजेस इन द सोसाइटी। तो इसने जो है बहुत एक अच्छी बात कही आर्नोल्ड टॉयनबी ने कि हिस्ट्री क्या है, बेसिकली ऐसे जो चैलेंजेस होते हैं और चैलेंजेस के साथ जो उनके रिस्पॉन्सेज होते हैं सोसाइटी के, उसको एक डिसिप्लिन है जो उसको स्टडी करता है. सो हिस्ट्री इज बेसिकली ए डिसिप्लिन विच स्टडीज द वेरियस काइंड ऑफ इंटरनल एंड एक्सटर्नल challenges and the responses shown by the society to this. That is how he has tried to define it. So his definition is somehow bringing it or giving a sort of complete definition, or it is bringing it very close to the real definition of history. So it's not only the study of the great personalities and leaders. So सबसे पहले, the moment you have decided to study history optional, the first of all you have to come out, you need to come out from those older perception that history is what, history is just the study of great leaders and all. आप सोचना ही छोड़ दीजिए इस तरीके से, क्योंकि आप जब तक ऐसे सोचते रहेंगे आप उसके उस कंटेंट को आप जस्टिफाई ही नहीं कर सकते हैं कि हमें पढ़ना क्या है. तो आपको अगर उसको जस्टिफाई करना है आपको, तो सबसे पहले आपको हिस्ट्री के परसेप्शन चेंज करने पड़ेंगे. ठीक है. सो वन आइडिया व्हिच वाज हाइलाइटेड बाय दिस पर्सन, एज आई हैव ऑलरेडी टोल्ड यू, व्हाट ही टॉक्स अबाउट द चेंजेस, राइट. एंड हिज आइडिया ऑफ चेंजेस had been further taken by another important person that you might have heard of, you might have heard of Hegel. Hegel was another important person who tried to define the history in a very different way. So that person talked about the challenges and the responses, right? So but then this person is focusing more on what? He is focusing more on the idea of changes. He talks about history is what? The changes. But then for historian, or let's say for history as a discipline, it is the most important thing to understand what are the important reason behind the changes. So when it comes to Hegel, so Hegel says that it is the idea which is bringing the change. Hegel says that it is an idea which brings the change. And when it comes to ideas, that was also explained by him in a very different way. How come the ideas are so much responsible for the changes? He says, Hegel says, that actually what happens in history you can talk about, there is one established idea in society, and then there is another opposite idea which is also there in society. Got my point? So what he says, this he expresses in a very different way, where he says basically the thesis, antithesis, and then he says ki basically when there is a sort of collision, or there is a sort of conflict between these two, the thesis and antithesis, that appears ultimately in which form? Synthesis, right? So he says ki actually there is one idea which is an established idea, there is another idea which is quite opposite idea, but then of course there is a conflict going on between these two, and over a period what happens, a new idea appears, that is called as synthesis. So ideas, thesis, opposite ideas, antithesis, and then finally a new idea, that is called as synthesis. But then the moment it comes to synthesis, right, the synthesis over the period becomes the new established idea, and then again an opposite idea. तो इन लोगों ने इसको नेक्स्ट स्टेज पे ये लोग लेके गए. इन्होंने कहा कि हिस्ट्री क्या है भाई, तो उन्होंने कहा कि हिस्ट्री जो है बेसिकली चेंजेस की स्टडी है. बट देन इट इज नॉट ओनली अंडरस्टैंड इट इज नॉट ओनली इंपॉर्टेंट टू अंडरस्टैंड जस्ट द चेंजेस, रादर वी हैव टू आल्सो अंडरस्टैंड कि व्हाट आर द रीजंस बिहाइंड द चेंजेस. तो इन्होंने कहा कि ये आइडियाज है, और आइडियाज किस तरीके से चेंज लेके आते वो मैंने बताया कि एक स्टैब्लिश्ड आइडियाज है, उसको किसी ने चैलेंज किया, ठीक है, और उसकी वजह से उस लगातार एक कॉन्फ्लिक्ट चलते रहती है दोनों के बीच में, और फाइनली क्या होता है, एक नया आइडिया निकल के आता है, और फिर उसकी वजह से जो है एक वो नया आइडिया क्रिएट हो जाता है, जिसको पहले तो हमने सिंथेसिस कहा, लेकिन बाद में जाके it itself establishes as a new idea, and then again the same process goes on. So throughout the history what is happening, the same thing is happening. And again I am very much convinced with this idea, because if we read history with this perception, we'll find that always there are new ideas which are coming, ठीक है, and that idea is being challenged by another idea. So ऐसा नहीं था कि शुरुआत से डेमोक्रेसी थी. आप में से कोई ऐसा नहीं मानता होगा कि since the beginning we had democracy. Of course we started sort of a kinship polity, and then there was several stages are coming, right? Because kinship polity, then tribal polity, and so on. So basically idea in terms of everything, polity, economy, society, you can apply these ideas. So this is how Hegel tries to define history, and that's a new addition to history, what he says. But then his idea was further changed. I won't say changed, but it was rectified by another very important person, that is called as Karl Marx. कार्ल मार्क्स क्या कहते हैं? कार्ल मार्क्स कहते हैं कि यार बात तो सही है कि हिस्ट्री इज बेसिकली द स्टडी ऑफ व्हाट? स्टडी ऑफ चेंजेस, but then it is not the idea which is primarily responsible for bringing all those changes. Rather he says कि actually the dialectic materialism is the most important thing. So you just leave this dialectic materialism, right now focus on one thing that is called as materialism. That's called as materialism. तो वो कहते हैं आइडियाज प्राइमरली रिस्पॉन्सिबल, ये कहते हैं कि नहीं यार मटेरियलिज्म इज प्राइमरली रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर ब्रिंगिंग ऑल दोस चेंजेस. बट देन फ्रॉम द टाइम ऑफ टोएनबी वन थिंग इज प्रीटी श्योर दैट एवरीबडी इज ट्राइंग टू अंडरस्टैंड व्हाट? चेंजेस. दैट्स द मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट थिंग. अब चेंजेस के साथ हमने एक दूसरी चीज एसोसिएट कर दी है. हमने क्या कहा? नहीं, चेंजेस के साथ जो है ये उसके पीछे रीजंस क्या है? व्हाट आर द रीजंस बिहाइंड इट व्हिच माइट बी रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर अंडरस्टैंडिंग दीज चेंजेस? देन ही इज सेइंग डायलेक्टिक मटेरियलिज्म. मैंने लास्ट क्लास में भी आपसे एक बात कही थी कि जो मार्क्सिस्ट हिस्टोरियोग्राफी है, जिसको आप यूजुअली लेफ्ट की हिस्टोरियोग्राफी कहते हैं या लेफ्ट की हिस्ट्री कहते हैं, वो क्या कहते हैं? वो इकोनॉमिक रीजंस ढूंढते हैं हर चीज के पीछे में. तो कार्ल मार्क्स ये कहते हैं कि अगर सती प्रैक्टिस हो रहा है, ठीक है, ऑफ कोर्स कार्ल मार्क्स डजंट टॉक अबाउट सती, आई एम जस्ट गिविंग एन एग्जांपल टू यू. तो ही सेज कि इट्स नॉट नेसेसरी दैट देयर माइट बी सम आइडिया बिहाइंड इट एज अ रीजन. He says कि there must be some economic reasons or some materialism responsible behind it for it. So that's how he defines it. So basically this person had presented a very different kind of perception, and this perception was basically taken by us as the definition of history. So that's how you can find that history as a discipline keeps on evolving itself, and it's a continuous phenomena. और अगर आपको लगता है कि ये चीजें रुक गई है तो ऐसा नहीं है, ठीक है. In fact, if I'll take the name of the other historians who has tried to define history, among the contemporary scholars, I can take the name of multiple new scholars who are still giving some additions, right? Maybe you must have heard of E.H. Carr. Have you heard of E.H. Carr? नहीं सुना है तो E.H. Carr जो है एक important scholar रहे 20th century में, जिन्होंने हिस्ट्री को डिफाइन करने की कोशिश की. There is another important person that's called as R.G. Collingwood. ठीक है, that's again in 20th century you find a very important scholar who has tried to define or do some addition in the understanding of history what we are having right now. Among some recent scholars I can talk about, let's say there are so many such as Natalo Jamon Deves is there, ठीक है, then that I have already, APJ Taylor is there, right? So that's how you can find there is a longer list of the scholars, those who have been continuously contributing, right? So one thing you make pretty sure, what I was trying to discuss in the last class also, that there is no fixed definition of history, ठीक है. So it is our problem that we always try to understand history with respect to what? The personalities. वो इतना पुराना perception है हिस्ट्री को पर्सनालिटी बेस समझने की, जो हम कोशिश करते हैं, वो बहुत पुराना perception है. और अगर आपको इसको समझना है, ठीक है, तो इंडियन हिस्ट्री हमेशा, आई एम सॉरी टू से यू लाइक दैट, बट येस इट इज ट्रू दैट इंडियन हिस्ट्री इज मच बिहाइंड देन द वेस्टर्न हिस्ट्री. It's much behind than the Western history. In fact, if I'll talk about the last 5 decades, you won't find that something new has started in India. Everything was happening basically in West, and it's being followed by us. You remember in the last class I had been discussing about the Annal school, I had been discussing about the postmodernism, I was talking about revisionist scholars. ये सारे changes Indian changes नहीं है. ये सारे चेंजेस कैसे, या न्यू मार्क्सिज्म है, ठीक है, ये सारे जो चेंजेस हैं ये वेस्टर्न कॉन्टेक्स्ट में आ रहे हैं और हम उनको धीरे धीरे फॉलो करते हैं. तो जो चीज़ें आज से 15-20 साल पहले तक यूरोप पे बड़े, अब तो यूरोप बहुत आगे निकल गया, यूरोप या अमेरिका में, वेस्टर्न कंट्रीज़ की बात कर रहा हूँ जहाँ पे रिसर्चेस में काफ़ी पैसा खर्च होता है, वहाँ पे वो तो काफ़ी आगे निकल गए. लेकिन उन्होंने जो आज से 3 डिकेड्स पहले जो चीज़ें शुरू की, अब हमने क्या किया, अब हम उसको फॉलो कर रहे हैं. और उसका इम्पैक्ट क्या है? एनाल्स, जैसे आपने शायद मार्क ब्लॉक के बारे में सुना होगा, या फिर यू मस्ट हैव हर्ड ऑफ let's say Mark Bloch is there, and then some other Henry Pirenne is there, ठीक है. ये सारे कुछ ऐसे स्कॉलर्स हैं जिन स्कॉलर्स ने जो है बड़े एनाल स्कूल के अंदर ये लोग आते हैं और इन लोगों ने एक नई तरीके से चीज़ों को डिफाइन करने की कोशिश की. तो उनका इम्पैक्ट अब धीरे धीरे जो है इंडियन हिस्ट्री में दिखना शुरू हो गया है. तो हमारी अंडरस्टैंडिंग हिस्ट्री के लिए बहुत चेंज है, ठीक है, इट हैज़ ड्रास्टिकली चेंज. But then it is also important, how do we understand history, how should we understand history? I'll simply say that history is basically the different kind of perceptions. That's very important. History is what? History is different kind of perceptions. Maybe my perception is different, than your perception, and then his perception, it's quite possible. But then nothing is right and wrong, and that's how, like, I'm trying to convey one idea very categorically, that once you guys are very particular about conclusion, actually you should not be. Why? Because history, like, in history it's very tough to like go for a firm conclusion, because history is all about perception. So history is like all about different kind of perception. So does it really mean that, like, we all are moving in different directions? No, not really. Perceptions are different, but then you should also, like, keep in mind that history ultimately studies what? History ultimately studies continuity and changes, where the continuity and changes in society. There is continuous change in the society, and at the same time there are certain things which do continue also. So basically, what do we do in history? We study all those, like, continuities and changes. That is the, like, most important thing. But then when it comes to this continuity and changes, as I told you, there are various perceptions for this. There are different perceptions that we, like, we are having. So as I told you that everybody's perception may be very different. But then, like, does it mean that everybody is entitled to write history? No, that is also not correct. अगर मैं बोलूं कि परसेप्शन सही है तो व्हाट्सएप में पढ़ाई जाने वाली हर चीज़ हिस्ट्री होनी चाहिए फिर, क्योंकि वो उनका परसेप्शन है और आप किसी परसेप्शन को गलत तो नहीं कह सकते, ठीक है। लेकिन हम ऐसा भी नहीं कह सकते कि कोई भी टॉम डिक एंड हैरी आता है और वो अपने हिसाब से बोल के जाता है कि यार चीज़ें ऐसी नहीं ऐसी थी, और आप उसको मान के लेंगे। हाँ, और आप जब आंसर लिखेंगे यूपीएससी में तब आप लिखेंगे कि सो एंड सो, टॉम ने ऐसा कहा था, डिक ने ऐसा कहा था और हैरी ने ऐसा कहा था। आप नहीं लिख सकते। तो इसका मतलब ऐसा नहीं कि कोई अथाह समुद्र है और हमें कुछ भी लिख सकते हैं और आपको मार्क्स मिल जाएगा, ऐसा भी नहीं है, ठीक है। हियर कम्स द सिग्निफिकेंस ऑफ समथिंग where exactly I wanted to come, that when it comes to history, any history, when it comes to any history, ultimately is the combination of two things. And what are these two things? One, that is called as historians, and there comes sources. It's very simple. It's very simple. Why historiography is very important? Because, like, ultimately this discipline is being run by certain historians. Nobody else can write history. व्हाट्सएप में जो आता है कि इसने ऐसा कर दिया, इसने ऐसा कर दिया, उसने ऐसा कर दिया, अब तो नए नए लड़के भी हिस्ट्री लिख रहे हैं, ठीक है। हाँ, मिलियन में सब्सक्राइबर है, बिलियन में व्यूज आ रही हैं, ठीक है। तो हम वो नहीं कोट कर सकते क्योंकि दे आर नॉट द ट्रेन्ड हिस्टोरियंस. And here the role of E.H. Carr or the interpretation of E.H. Carr is very important. I would like to briefly discuss about him. I'm just trying to come to the main point only, but then certain, like, things which are there in periphery should be very clear in your mind, because if you, like, these ideas are clear in your mind, then, like, you will be having a right perception for history. You won't be very confused. E.H. Carr कहते हैं कि E.H. Carr is simply saying कि it is the study of sources by the historians, and the historians those who are professionals, those who have been trained in this particular discipline. I always used to say कि the moment you have been going for research, तो ऐसा नहीं होता कि you did your masters and then you directly jumped into the research. The moment you have been going for the research, there is a proper training which is provided to you, and that's called as coursework for PhD and MPhil. And in this, like, coursework, what happens there? You have been simply, like, conveyed, you have been trained, you have been taught that how the sources should be used, how the interpretation should be done, and that is how you become eligible for writing history. That's the process. So what is this trained historian? So basically he talks about this, right? And then he talks about, E.H. Carr is very particular about something that's called as sources, and he simply says that there is no history without sources. Of course there is no history without sources. And how come the sources are more relevant in ancient India? That also I'll try to discuss. Just wait for some time. Okay. But then the moment it comes to this definition also, so you should think in this particular manner that if it is about the combination of historians and the sources, so now there is no further complications. But actually it is also not correct. Now here there are so many permutations and combinations that can be made. Historians, like, may be what? They may be biased. और ये हिस्ट्री में एक बहुत बड़ी जो है क्या कहूँ मैं डिलेमा है, ठीक है, बहुत बड़ी कंफ्यूजन है कि हम कैसे एक एक्यूरेट हिस्ट्री लिखें। There was one point of time where there was a greater debate in history that whether history is a science or not. What happens in science? Well, how come you can differentiate between the science and the humanities paper? Objectivity. Very nice. Objectivity is the major problem, major difference between these two. Now the point is that if you have been really reading a very scattered kind of history, then what is the point of reading history if it is so much scattered? तो कुछ लोगों ने आउटराइटली रिजेक्ट किया कि हम ये कैसे मान लें कि हिस्टोरियंस जो है वो बहुत जो है वो अनबायस्ड होगा और वो चीज़ें वैसे नहीं लिखेगा जैसा उसका मन कर रहा हो। तो इसके पीछे दो चीज़ें हैं। देख, सब पहले जो है व्हेन इट कम्स टू द क्वेश्चन ऑफ बायसेस ऑफ द हिस्टोरियंस, ईएच कार आंसर्स दिस कि इट्स नॉट नेसेसरी दैट हिस्टोरियंस आर ऑलवेज बायस। लोगों की जो प्रेजुडिस होती है वो हमारी जो प्रेजुडिस है वो हिस्टोरियन की प्रेजुडिस से बहुत अलग होगी, क्योंकि हिस्टोरियन एक ट्रेनिंग से एक जो है चीज से बंधे हुए हैं, दैट इज कॉल्ड एज सोर्सेस। एंड दैट्स व्हाई आई ऑलवेज से कि व्हाट इज द डिफरेंस बिटवीन फिक्शन एंड हिस्ट्री। जब कोई बॉलीवुड फिल्म मेकर या हॉलीवुड फिल्म मेकर फिल्म बनाता है तो शुरुआत में एक डिस्क्लेमर देता है कि जो है ये फिक्शनल है और इसका हकीकत से कोई वास्ता हम ऐसा बिल्कुल क्लेम नहीं करते हैं। अदरवाइज क्या होता है आपको भी पता है। जब हनुमान जी ने वो डायलॉग बोला, ठीक है, तो बड़ा हंगामा हो गया। तो बाद में हमने तो रामायण बनाई नहीं, हमने तो कुछ और बनाया था। नहीं, मतलब उसने कहा कि हमने तो रामायण बनाया नहीं, हमने तो ये युग पुरुष या आदि पुरुष जो भी था, आदि पुरुष, हमने तो वो बनाया था, इसका रामायण से कोई लेना देना नहीं। तो आप ऐसा करते, आपके पास वो लिबर्टी है, हिस्टोरियंस के पास वो लिबर्टी नहीं है। अगर किसी हिस्टोरियंस को ये कहते हुए पकड़ा गया कि या ये करते हुए पकड़ा गया कि सोर्सेज उनको ऐसा कहने के लिए नहीं कह रहे थे, फिर भी वो ऐसी बात लिख रहे, इसका मतलब ही इज नॉट ए हिस्टोरियन। दैट्स द डिफरेंस, राइट। सो हिस्ट्री और फिक्शन के बीच में हमेशा डिफरेंस है। तो जब हिस्टोरियन को सोर्स अगर मिल रहा है, ठीक है, तो उसके अगेंस्ट जाके वो नहीं लिख सकते, बिकॉज दिस इज हाउ ही और सी इज बीइंग ट्रेन्ड। सो ऐसा नहीं कि इसके ऊपर कोई लिमिटेशंस नहीं है, ऑफ कोर्स लिमिटेशंस आर देयर। सो बेसिकली हिस्टोरियंस आर बाउंड टू लाइक कंसल्ट सोर्सेस एंड व्हाटसोएवर इज बीइंग आस्क्ड टू देम और बीइंग कन्वेड बाय देम टू द बाय द सोर्सेस, लाइक दे हैव टू राइट एनीथिंग एज पर दैट ओनली. So E.H. Carr is saying कि I think it would be very unnecessary to actually talk about great biases of the historians, because they are ultimately tied with the norms and let's say some rules and regulations of a discipline, and that's why you can't blame in this way. R.G. Collingwood कहते हैं, R.G. Collingwood again a great scholar of great scholar historian, he says कि no, you can't say कि historians are not biased. Historians are biased, ठीक है. Historians are biased because they were very much influenced by their society, their surroundings and everything. अगर मेरी परवरिश एक ऐसी जगह पे हुई है जहाँ पे हमेशा मुझे बताया गया कि यार औरंगजेब जो है बहुत ख़राब आदमी था, मैं अगर 25 साल तक मुझे ये बताया गया कि औरंगजेब ख़राब आदमी है, औरंगजेब ख़राब आदमी है, लेकिन ऑफ कोर्स दिस पर्टिकुलर परसेप्शन वुड बी देयर इन माय माइंड दैट यस ऑफ कोर्स देयर वाज सर्टेन प्रॉब्लम विद द औरंगजेब. तो जब मैं सोर्सेज इंटरप्रेट करूंगा, ठीक है, तो उस समय मेरे दिमाग में वो चीज़ें रहेंगी. E.H. Carr भी इसको कहते हैं. E.H. Carr कहते हैं कि यार देयर आर thousands, lakhs of fallen sources, right, or lakhs of sources available. Now, of course, historian cannot consult all the sources, right? So, what historians are supposed to do? Historians are definitely becoming selective while consulting the sources. ऐसा नहीं होता है कि जो है उसने वो सारे sources जो है वो consult करा और सारे sources को consult करके history लिख रहा है, वैसा नहीं कहते. वो कहते हैं कि of course historians have to be selected. Why? Because when once somebody finds so many sources, in that case it is quite possible that historians are shortlisting few of them, and as per that only he or she is writing history. That possibility is there. तो जहाँ तक सेलेक्टिवनेस है या फिर जो है जो ऑब्जेक्टिविटी है हिस्ट्री की, वो डाउटफुल तो रहती है, ठीक है. वो एकदम 100% ऑब्जेक्टिव नहीं हो सकता है. एंड इनफैक्ट देयर इज एन अनदर थिंग व्हिच इज डिफरेंशिएटिंग बिटवीन साइंस एंड हिस्ट्री और साइंस एंड ह्यूमैनिटीज, दैट इन साइंस वी कैन बिकम एम्पिरिकल, इन ह्यूमैनिटीज वी कैन नॉट बिकम एम्पिरिकल. तो हम उसको कभी प्रूव नहीं कर सकते कि चीजें ऐसी हुई होगी. कलिंगा वॉर को देखने के बाद जैसी फीलिंग अशोका को आई, अभी हम वापस वो सीन क्रिएट नहीं कर सकते कि दोबारा क्रिएट करके देखें कि एक दूसरा राजा है तो वैसा ही फील कर रहा है या नहीं कर रहा है। बहुत सिंपल सी बात। तो ये इंपीरिकल नहीं है। तो एक बात तो हमने बहुत बहस करना छोड़ दिया कि ऑब्जेक्टिविटी हिस्ट्री में है या नहीं है। ऑफ कोर्स इट इज नॉट देयर, and there comes the new schools, right? Because they are getting the chance, because of course, like when it started, history as a discipline started, I'm just talking about like 100 talking about a period 100 years back. At that point of time, yes, historians, scholars were struggling with this question, why can't we deal history as a like as an objective paper? They had been struggling with this question. But then over the period they had realized no, actually it's impossible to like go for great amount of objectivity, though it is correct, it should be there, like there should be a great objectivity. And अगर वाकई ऐसा हो जाए कि हिस्ट्री बहुत ऑब्जेक्टिव पेपर हो जाए तो आपके लिए चीज़ें बहुत आसान हो जाएंगी। फिर आपको एनालिसिस नहीं देना है, आपको डिफरेंट व्यूज नहीं देने हैं। आपको पता है कि हाँ भाई चंद्रगुप्त मौर्य जो है वो हाउ कम ही वाज कैपेबल ऑफ स्टैब्लिशिंग द मौर्यन एम्पायर, लाइक यू मस्ट बी हैविंग ए सेट ऑफ लाइक आइडियाज कि ओके दीज 3-4 पॉइंट्स आर देयर एंड यू हैव जस्ट रिटन देम एंड यू हैव प्रूव्ड, हेंस इट इज प्रूव्ड कि दीज आर द फैक्टर्स रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर द एस्टैब्लिशमेंट ऑफ द मौर्यन एम्पायर। करेक्ट? वो नहीं हो सकता। एंड दैट्स हाउ हिस्ट्री इज बिट कॉम्प्लिकेटेड। ठीक है, वहां पे फिर मैंने क्या कहा कि अगर ये ऑब्जेक्टिविटी पॉसिबल नहीं है, इसका मतलब हिस्ट्री रहेगा तो सब्जेक्टिव है। ऑफ कोर्स इट इज अ सब्जेक्टिव पेपर। और मैंने जब कल एनाल्स की बात या फिर पोस्ट मॉडर्निज्म की बात मैंने की थी, यहीं पे इनकी इंपॉर्टेंस बढ़ जाती है कि यहाँ पे या तो आप ये कोशिश करें कि आप पूरी तरीके से कोई ना कोई फर्म कंक्लूजन दे दें कि ये था राइट रीजन इसके पीछे में, और एक दूसरी पॉसिबिलिटी क्या है कि आप एनाल्स या पोस्ट मॉडर्निज्म की तरह क्या करते हैं, आप 4 रीजंस बताते हैं कि भैया ये 4 रीजंस हैं जो पॉसिबल हो सकते हैं इसके पीछे, आप सोच लीजिए क्या हो सकता है इसमें। यही होता है। तो हिस्ट्री में हिस्टोरियंस की इंपॉर्टेंस क्यों बढ़ जाती है? इसकी वजह से बढ़ जाती है कि वो ऑब्जेक्टिविटी नहीं हो सकती, वो सब्जेक्टिविटी है, और हम ये तय नहीं कर सकते, वी कैन नॉट डिसाइड कि दिस इज राइट एंड दिस इज रॉन्ग। We can't decide it. And then if we'll discuss about this whole process, right, if we'll discuss about this whole process, in that case I must tell you that this process is getting influenced by several other things. The process of history writing is being influenced by several other things. So if I'll say that what are the things which are like somehow impacting this process of history writing, so I can say that time is something which is very important. Isn't that correct? In which particular period it is being written, it is very important. Maybe what perception we had 30 years back, that perception has got changed, and that's why we can say that time may be one crucial reason or very important reason for different kind of perception. But then again, it is not true that the older perception was wrong and the newer perception is correct. The newer perception is nothing but one more interpretation of it. And they all are falling in the category of history because nobody is writing the history without consulting sources. Everybody is consulting sources. Either you say the Marxist scholars, you say the right-wing scholars, you say nationalist scholar or revisionist. Everybody is consulting sources and they are giving the new interpretation, and that's why we cannot say that this interpretation is right and this interpretation is wrong. Every interpretation is right for us because we are students of history. We are no one to give the conclusion, and that's the reason because of time does play a very important role, right? Frankly speaking, this plays a great role इन द हिस्टोरिकल नैरेटिव्स। ये समझाने की जरूरत तो है नहीं, आप बेहतर समझते। और अगर आपको लगता है कि दीज काइंड ऑफ थिंग्स आर हैपनिंग ओनली इन इंडिया, देन दिस इज योर मिसकंसेप्शन। दिस हैपेंस एवरीवेयर। बिल्कुल हो सकता है। सोर्स खुद में बायस नहीं होते, मैं उस पर भी आ रहा हूं, ठीक है, आई एम जस्ट कमिंग टू दैट पॉइंट। बट ये तो है कि पॉलिटी जो है बिल्कुल एक तरीके की नैरेटिव्स क्रिएट करवाना चाहती है। फिर से मैं बोलूंगा माइकल फूको, याद है ना, हमने पिछले क्लास में माइकल फूको के बारे में बात की थी। माइकल फूको क्या कहते हैं? नॉलेज ऑल्सो कैन बी क्रिएटेड विद द हेल्प ऑफ पावर। अगर आपके पास पावर है आप नॉलेज क्रिएट कर सकते हैं। और आपने मान लीजिए आपने स्कूल टेक्स्ट में एक चेंज इंट्रोड्यूस किया और बच्चों को वो पढ़ा, तो बच्चे तो उसी माइंडसेट के साथ बड़े होंगे। और मैं फिर से कह रहा हूं कि अगर आप सोच रहे हैं कि ऐसा जो है किसी खास कंट्रीज में होता होगा, बिल्कुल भी नहीं। अमेरिका में जितनी हिस्ट्री जो है चेंज हुई है या जितनी फ्रिक्वेंटली चेंज हुई है उतनी तो मुझे लगता है कि दुनिया में कहीं नहीं होगी जितनी फ्रिक्वेंटली अमेरिका में हिस्ट्री जो है मतलब हिस्ट्री वाज इन्फ्लुएंस्ड बाय द पॉलिटी और लेट्स से द रूलिंग पावर्स। हिस्ट्री अगर आप देखेंगे अमेरिकन हिस्टोरियोग्राफी, तो अमेरिकन हिस्टोरियोग्राफी में आपको कैसे मिलेंगे, आपको प्यूरिटन्स मिलेंगे, पेटिसन मिलेंगे, प्रोफेशनल्स मिलेंगे। और प्रोफेशनल्स के अंदर से इतने सारे ग्रुप्स हैं, उसमें प्रोग्रेसिव हिस्टोरियंस हैं, उसमें कंजर्वेटिव हिस्टोरियंस हैं, प्रोग्रेसिव हिस्टोरियंस हैं, न्यू कंजर्वेटिव्स हैं, न्यू प्रोग्रेसिव्स हैं, लेफ्ट है, न्यू लेफ्ट है, रिविजनिस्ट हैं, इतने सारे। और वो चल रहा है, वो प्रोसेस अभी भी ऑन है। और जब 1940s के आसपास या 1920s ऑनवर्ड्स जब रसिया में सोशलिज्म आ जाता है, तो आपको पता है कि अमेरिका में लाइक दे वर डाई हार्ड, दे वर टोटली अगेंस्ट द आइडिया ऑफ सोशलिज्म। But at the same time, you should also keep in mind that the chances of coming of socialism is more in a capitalist country. Isn't that true? सबसे ज़्यादा चांस सोशलिज्म के आने के कहाँ है? कैपिटलिस्ट कंट्री में, क्योंकि कैपिटलिस्ट कंट्री में ही सबसे ज़्यादा क्लास डिफरेंस क्रिएट होता है। So the high chances of entry of socialism is there in a capitalist country. America was the greatest capitalist country at that point of time, so there were high chances that socialism would have entered into America. So this was taken as a challenge by the American government कि somehow they needed to stop it, the entry of socialism. तो अगर अमेरिकन सोसाइटी, पूरी अमेरिकन हिस्ट्री इस आइडिया पे बेस्ड है कि क्या अमेरिकन सोसाइटी एक यूनाइटेड सोसाइटी है या एक ऐसी सोसाइटी है जिसमें बहुत सारे कॉन्फ्लिक्ट्स हैं। अब पूरी अमेरिकन हिस्ट्री ऐसे चलती है क्यों? क्योंकि वो बात करते हैं कि अमेरिकन जो लोग कंजर्वेटिव या फिर न्यू कंजर्वेटिव ग्रुप से आते हैं, वो लिखते हैं कि नहीं, अमेरिकन सोसाइटी हमेशा से यूनाइटेड रही है। और जो लोग प्रोग्रेसिव हैं या लेफ्ट आइडियोलॉजी से इंस्पायर्ड है, वो लोग क्या लिखेंगे? नहीं, अमेरिकन सोसाइटी में क्लास डिफरेंसेस है। तो पूरी हिस्ट्री, और जब 1920 ऑनवर्ड सरकारें जो बनती है, उन सरकारों ने क्या किया? उन सरकारों ने खूब पैसा पंप किया और पैसा पंप करके उन्होंने एक ऐसी हिस्ट्री जानबूझ के जो स्पॉन्सर की, जिस हिस्ट्री में लिखा गया कि नहीं, अमेरिकन सोसाइटी में कभी भी कोई कॉन्फ्लिक्ट रहा ही नहीं है फ्रॉम द टाइम ऑफ इंडिपेंडेंस। वाई फ्रॉम द टाइम ऑफ इंडिपेंडेंस? फ्रॉम द टाइम ऑफ कॉलोनाइजेशन ऑफ अमेरिका, यूएसए, लाइक देयर वाज नो सच कॉन्फ्लिक्ट इन अमेरिकन सोसाइटी। इट हैज ऑलवेज बीन ए सोसाइटी which was having great amount of unity and so on. That's how they have defined it. That's how they have written their history. So of course, political powers are always an influential factor in this. What else, right? Then he was talking about sources. Yes, this is very important to understand that sources also do bring the changes in the history writing. But the sources are bringing the changes in multiple respect or in through multiple ways. Now I can tell you that it is quite possible, right? It is quite possible that there are some new sources are coming. Of course, we have been going for continuous excavations and all, and they might bring some new sources. And once the new sources are coming, so of course the older interpretations are either being challenged or being changed, so on. So new sources are coming. The changing interpretations, the same source can be reinterpreted again and again. That possibility is always there. 20 years back when this pen was found, at that point of time, somebody has interpreted this particular example in a very different way. And what was that? They said ki nahi, it is a sort of it is a sort of knife, or let's say it's a borer hai, ye kuch bhi hai. उन्होंने ऐसा कहा, ये तो इसी के लिए यूज होता होगा, बोरर है ये। 20 साल के बाद एक हिस्टोरियन आया, उन्होंने कहा कि नहीं यार, ये बोरर नहीं है, इससे तो लोग लिखते थे। So this is the new interpretation, and in fact, we are going to discuss about these kind of things. Ki how come the mother goddess was being interpreted 30 years back in a very different way, and nowadays this mother goddess is being being interpreted in a very different way. The things are being newly interpreted or reinterpreted, I must say. That is also one thing. So I can say कि new sources are coming, new interpretations are coming. ठीक है. So these are certain changes which are coming, which were there in the sources, and that's how we can say कि history is a continuous process of writing. ये कई बार आपसे इंटरव्यू में सवाल पूछते हैं कि क्या जो है हिस्ट्री को रीराइट करना चाहिए, आर वी सपोज टू रीराइट द हिस्ट्री? and the students are very confused ki how to answer. Of course, it is a basic inherent nature of history that it should be rewritten, and if history is not being written again and again, it means that you are reading ultimately a dead history. It is a dead history. History is a alive subject, राइट लेकिन आपका पढ़ने का तरीका वैसा होना चाहिए कि आप जो है उन सारी नई चीज़ों को इंटरप्रेट कर रहे हैं। नहीं तभी मैंने कहा कि पिछले 10 सालों पहले 10 साल पहले तक जो नेचर था इस सब्जेक्ट का इंडिया में वो बहुत डिफरेंट था यार, बहुत अलग था। इट वॉज लाइक वेरी डिफरेंट, बट इन लास्ट 10-15 ईयर्स सर्टन बेसिक चेंजेस कुड बी नोटिस इन द सब्जेक्ट एंड इनफैक्ट इट्स इम्पैक्ट कैन बी डायरेक्टली नोटिस ऑन योर सब्जेक्ट, ऑन योर यूपीएससी क्वेश्चन पेपर। तो आप अगर इसको नहीं समझते हैं तो प्रॉब्लम है, राइट? Okay, last thing I would like to discuss, like here, that's again very important, that when it comes to the history, the way I did tell you that history is basically what is basically the study by historians of sources, right? अब देखिए ये दोनों ही हमारे लिए सोर्स है। अभी तक तो मैंने आपको ये ओरिजिनल बताया, लेकिन और हिस्टोरियंस आर स्टडिंग sources and they are writing history, but then I must tell you that what is this for us, so this is for us is secondary sources and this is primary sources. हमारे लिए दोनों ही sources and we are supposed to study the subject with respect to both. Of course, we are reading only these books because it's not possible for us that just to clear the UPSC, we are studying the primary sources. IBC जाके स्टडी कर रहे हैं सारा, जो मदर गॉडेस ऐसी थी ऐसी दिखते हैं, पॉसिबल नहीं है मैंने। तो हमारे लिए क्या इंपॉर्टेंट है कि हम सिर्फ सेकेंडरी सोर्सेज पढ़ते हैं। वी आर जस्ट स्टडिंग द सेकेंडरी सोर्सेज एंड द सेकेंडरी सोर्सेज विच आर रिटन ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ व्हाट primary sources. हमारे लिए this is the only thing which is important. Now this secondary source becomes historiography for us, and then since they have written it on the basis of the primary source, and that's why we are supposed to understand the history with respect to the primary source also. Because as I did tell you in the last class also, if you have been referring the primary sources, in that case, of course, the influence what we have been creating after writing that answer will be much more greater than the person who hasn't mentioned the primary sources. तो हमारे लिए दोनों इंपॉर्टेंट है। ये हमारे लिए हिस्टोरियोग्राफी बनती है एंड दिस बिकम्स द सोर्सेज फॉर अस, राइट? सो व्हाट वी हैव बीन रेफरिंग, सो दैट्स हाउ आई होप यू गॉट माय पॉइंट कि हाउ कम द हिस्टोरियोग्राफी एंड द सोर्सेज बोथ आर वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट। And let me tell you one more thing that's again very important, and this is the last thing I'm telling you, and then I'll switch to the exactly the topic. So basically what is that, when it comes to the sources, right? So the sources are something which can, as I told you, that it is being interpreted and reinterpreted again and again, but then the importance of the sources as per the time is also changing. When it comes to ancient India, the sources are more important, right? And when it comes to medieval India, sources are lesser important, and in modern India, sources are very less important. So the importance of source is there more, okay? If I'll talk about the importance of sources, in that case, when we study ancient India, it is very important. When it comes to medieval India, it is important. And when it comes to the modern India or the modern world as well, right, here what happens, it is less important for us. Why? Because the vagueness of the sources is keeping the history a bit dicey. When it comes to ancient India, since we are more depending on archaeological and the literary sources, and the possibility is there, in fact, I'll say that when it is about ancient India, so it's very important to understand that the historicity itself is very doubtful. I hope you got the meaning of this here particular word. Historicity. whatever we have found or whatever is being written by someone in the ancient times, like it's very tough ki on the basis of that we can fix something, we can locate something. It's not that easy. And that's why the moment it comes to the ancient India, there are multiple interpretation of sources. इसको थोड़ा आसान मैं ऐसे करता हूँ आपके लिए. अगर मैं ये कहूँ आपसे कि like let's say Alexander's invasion. Now it is quite possible that somebody could come up with this idea कि Alexander has not invaded India. That possibility is there. So अगर आपके पास कुछ ऐसे firm arguments आते हैं on the basis of sources, in that case the things may become dicey. But if somebody is saying कि non-cooperation movement never took place in India, then is it like, are you going to believe in it? No, you can't believe in it. That's how the sources do play very important role. Now as per the time, हम हिस्टोरिसिटी पे बहुत डाउट नहीं करते हैं, बहुत मॉडर्न इंडिया में डाउट नहीं करते, लेकिन जब एंशिएंट इंडिया होती तो डाउट्स होते हैं. क्यों मैं कहता हूं कि पेपर 1 में आपको सोर्सेज रेफर करने चाहिए? क्योंकि वहां पे हिस्टोरिसिटी क्या है? डाउटफुल है. तो अगर आप हिस्टोरियंस के इंटरप्रिटेशंस पे ज़्यादा जाएंगे तो प्रॉब्लम क्या है कि आपको बहुत ज़्यादा इंटरप्रिटेशन करना पड़ेगा. और आप जितना प्राइमरी सोर्सेज को रेफर करके आंसर लिखेंगे, ठीक है, आपके आंसर्स में उतना जो है ऑब्जेक्टिवनेस या ऑब्जेक्टिविटी उतनी ज़्यादा आएगी. एंड दैट्स व्हाई आई ऑलवेज आस्क यू टू रेफर द प्राइमरी सोर्सेज इन पेपर 1. Now it is not that easy, I do believe. ठीक है. Why it's not that easy? Because like there were so many primary sources. When it comes to like certain archaeological sources, it's easy for us to like remember. When it comes to like literary sources, then it is not that easy for us. Let's say if I have been saying about the evolution of Varna system, so then Devi, or let's say if I'll be talking about the condition of women, so there are different texts, they have been interpreting the things in a very different way. तो वो चीज़ों को अलग अलग तरीके से कर रहे हैं. तो अगर हमें उतनी सारी किताबें याद हो, इतना आसान नहीं. ऑफ कोर्स इट इज़ वेरी टफ फॉर अस टू रिमेंबर ऑल दीज बुक्स. इट्स नॉट दैट ईजी. तो थोड़ा मुश्किल तो है एंशिएंट इंडिया में. बट हम व्हेन वी आर गोइंग टू स्टडी इट, वी आर जस्ट गोइंग टू क्लासिफाई द सोर्सेज इन सर्टेन कैटेगरीज एंड दैट्स हाउ वी आर गोइंग टू रिटेन इट. Or frankly speaking, if you are having a list of some of the archaeological sources, I mean certain inscriptions, and then certain books which are most important books, because yes, I must tell you that historians are always selective while referring the sources. So this is not true that historians are trying to interpret all the sources which are available. Rather what historians are doing, historians are basically like consulting few of the sources. So our history is mostly based on few sources. एक ब्राह्मण है, ब्राह्मण मतलब नॉट ए ह्यूमन बीइंग, ब्राह्मण एज अ टेक्स्ट, सतपथ ब्राह्मण. Satpat Brahmin is very important. Why? Do you know why? Because majorly Satpat Brahmin has helped to write the history of ancient India. In the same way I can talk about Jatkas which are very helpful for writing the ancient Indian history. हालांकि जातकास का इस्तेमाल पिछले 2 डेकेड्स में ज़्यादा बढ़ा है, उससे पहले लोग नहीं करते थे जातकास का इस्तेमाल. तो आपको पता होना चाहिए, और अगर आपका थोड़ा सेंस है, आपने चीज़ें क्लास में ठीक से समझ ली, आपको पता चल जाएगा कि ये आर्ग्यूमेंट देने वाला जो है कौन से सोर्सेज को रेफर कर रहा होगा. तो यू कैन राइट ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ दैट. So of course it is a bit tough in ancient India because we need to remember certain sources. But then when it comes to medieval India, nobody ever talks about the primary sources. पता ही नहीं है. हम ज़्यादा इंपॉर्टेंस किसको देते हैं? हिस्टोरियंस का. और सच कहिए तो medieval में लोग हिस्टोरियंस को भी बहुत इंपॉर्टेंस नहीं देते हैं. As the moment it comes to medieval, majority of the aspirants and others are knowing of just few historians. ठीक है. एक ले दे के नाम पता है सतीश चंद्र का. हाँ, आरसी मजुमदार तो एंशिएंट इंडिया लिखते हैं. एक इरफान हबीब फिक्स है वो, है ना. तो बहुत कम हिस्टोरियंस. एनीवेज हिस्टोरियंस के बारे में तो बात करना है ही जरूरी, लेकिन हिस्टोरियंस के साथ साथ जो है यहाँ पे भी सोर्सेज की बड़ी इंपॉर्टेंस है. और अगर अगेन आप जो है आप उसके सोर्सेज के बेसिस पे चीज़ों को समझने की कोशिश करेंगे, तो ऐसा नहीं कि मिडीवल पीरियड में बहुत सारे सोर्सेज है. देयर आर सर्टेन बुक्स, देयर आर नो आर्कियोलॉजिकल सोर्सेज व्हिच आर बीइंग कंसल्टेड बाय अस अ लॉट. मोस्टली वी आर रिलाइंग ऑन व्हाट लिटरेरी सोर्सेज, एंड फॉर एवरी पीरियड देयर आर सर्टेन लिटरेरी सोर्सेज. और आपको कुछ नहीं करना. ऐसा नहीं कि व्हेन इल्तुतमिश इज देयर, there are 4 different authors had been writing or interpreting Iltutmish in different ways. हर पीरियड में आपको एक या मैक्सिमम 2 राइटर्स मिल जाएंगे, इतने ही है। तो कितने रूलर्स हुए यार मेडिवल पीरियड में, ये सारे रूल, इनके नाम याद करने हैं। और मैक्सिमम क्या है, इससे भी और अच्छा करना चाहते हैं तो कुछ ट्रैवलर्स इंडिया आ रहे हैं, उन ट्रैवलर्स को थोड़ा याद करना है, दैट्स इट, काम हो गया। तो मेडिवल में भी आपको सोर्सेज लिखने की आदत डालनी चाहिए। सो एज फार एज पेपर 1 इज कंसर्न, राइट, in paper 1 you should develop this habit of using sources like as much as possible for you, and undoubtedly we are going to emphasize on the sources because they do play very important role. तो हम तो sources पे बहुत ज़्यादा बात करेंगे, sources पे primary पे भी और secondary पे भी हमारी, like of course this is our USP that we do talk about it. In modern, since I have told you that primary sources are not very important, but still, like if you remember the names of certain newspapers and other things, like that is quite good for you. But yet I'll say one more thing to you, कि when it comes to the modern India, here I guess the way here the primary sources are playing most important role, right? Here secondary sources are playing the most important role. Modern में हमें secondary sources पे ज़्यादा ध्यान रखना चाहिए, since the historicity is not very doubtful, and that's why we should focus more on what, like the secondary sources, that means historiography, and there are more interpretations which are available in for modern India, and that's why we should focus more on the historiography in this particular area. That's how we should cover it. So this is all about about the basic idea of sources. I hope, I believe that now clarity is there, how come the sources are important and why the sources should be definitely referred while writing the answer. Is it okay with you, right? So that's finished this particular part, and let's move to the first important topic, that's called as sources. That is about sources. Just a second. Okay, so as I did tell you that sources are important and what are the utilities and the significance of the sources. So as per that only we'll try to cover the sources. I did tell you that for past couple of years, I think for past 2018 I remember they had asked one question. After 2018 there was just one question that was asked on the foreign accounts. Last year only they have asked this account on the foreign question on the foreign accounts. So basically the number of questions are actually getting less from the sources, कम हो रहे हैं. बट क्या इसका मतलब है कि सोर्सेज की इंपॉर्टेंस खत्म हो गई है? ऑफ कोर्स नॉट, राइट. सोर्सेज आर ऑलवेज इंपॉर्टेंट एंड दैट्स व्हाई वी शुड कीप इन माइंड. इन फैक्ट व्हाइल अंडरस्टैंडिंग द सोर्सेज वी हैव टू कीप इन माइंड कपल ऑफ थिंग्स, that there are certain sources which were not being studied by historians, or they were not given the due preference or the due importance, not preference, the due importance by some older scholars. But then these sources are also becoming important in the current times. So we have to keep a proper note on that, proper study on that also. So this is how we are going to study, right? Okay, fine. So when it comes to sources, there are two distinct kind of sources. That is, one is literary sources and the second is archaeological sources, right? So now when it comes to literary sources, now literary sources can be also divided into two parts. And what are these two? One is religious sources and the second one was secular sources, right? And then the religious sources in Indian context can be divided into Brahminical sources, Buddhist sources, and Jain sources, right? When it comes to secular sources, now secular sources can be again divided into two parts. One is Indian and one is फॉरेन अकाउंट्स, राइट? दो अलग अलग तरीके के डिविजन्स हो सकते हैं सेक्युलर सोर्सेस में. व्हेन इट कम्स टू द इंडियन सोर्सेस, राइट, सॉरी, व्हेन इट कम्स टू इंडियन सोर्सेस, नाउ देयर मस्ट बी different kind of classifications of the sources which are like Indian, such as there are so many texts which were related to what? They are related to basically, let's write here, they are related to polity. Am I correct? Such as, can you tell me the name of few? अर्थशास्त्र, नीति सारा, अमुक्त मल्यदा, ठीक है. बहुत सारी किताबें हैं जो हम किस कैटेगरी में रख सकते हैं, वो पॉलिटिकल इन्फॉर्मेशन हमें प्रोवाइड करती है, ठीक है. देन आफ्टर पॉलिटिकल, लाइक वी कैन टॉक अबाउट सर्टेन बुक्स विच वर प्रोवाइडिंग अस इंफॉर्मेशन ऑन इकोनॉमी. There we can talk about again Arthashastra is a very important book which is giving us information about the economy. And then apart from that we can talk about like such as Jatkas giving us information about the economy. Yeah, of course. But then of course हाँ, Jatkas को कई बार इधर भी रखते हैं हम. So that's the reason because of what I'm talking about that. So there are several texts which are giving us information about this, like economy also. Then we can talk about, let's say there are certain biographies. Correct? The biographies such as Harsh Charit, Kumar Pal Charit, Rampal Charit, Musik Vamsa, ठीक है. So that's how there is a series, or there was a long list of the biographies, and the biographies are also telling us about basically what, like about the about the history and various other things, right? The various information about the society. So we can talk about the biographies also. So this is how we can keep them in multiple categories, and that's how we have to understand it. And then the next one is about basically the archaeological sources. And when it comes to the archaeological sources, let me create a division, otherwise it might create the confusion, right? So this is secular sources, and then it comes to archaeological sources, okay? In the category of archaeological sources, normally there are three kind of sources are kept. One is mounds, then yes, inscriptions, and third is coins. Are you okay? Mounds, inscriptions and coins. ये तीन अलग अलग तरीके की सोर्सेज हैं जो हम आर्कियोलॉजिकल कैटेगरी में रखते हैं. Now let's start the discussion one by one. So of course we'll be going for the literary sources first. So let's deal with first Brahminical sources. Let's talk about Brahminical sources. Now again a disclaimer. When we study the same topics in general studies, approach is very different. When we study the same topic in optional, the approach is very different. And that's why I focus, or I always keep on saying this particular point again and again. Identify the requirement. Identify the requirements, because what is going to be asked in the optional, they are not going to ask this question ki okay, write about this particular source. They are not going to ask in this way. वो आपसे ये पूछेंगे कि how come the literary sources can be used for writing history? What are the beauties of the literary sources or the Brahminical sources? ठीक है. So the nature of question is altogether different. In pre, they are going to ask very different kind of questions. If you have been studying them for general studies, the questions are very different. सो सबसे पहले जब भी आप कोई टॉपिक पढ़ते हैं ना, ये आपके लिए बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है कि आप उससे आइडेंटिफाई करिए कि इस पे पॉसिबिलिटी ऑफ क्वेश्चंस कितनी और है तो कहाँ से। तो इंस्टेड ऑफ वेस्टिंग योर टाइम फॉर एवरीथिंग व्हाट यू नीड टू डू, यू हैव टू आइडेंटिफाई दोज टॉपिक्स एंड यू नीड टू प्रिपेयर दैट, लाइक दोज टॉपिक्स कि हाँ ठीक है, लाइक व्हेन इट कम्स टू सोर्सेस दीज 4-5 क्वेश्चंस मे बी आस्क्ड फ्रॉम द सोर्सेस, दैट्स इट, लाइक वी हैव टू फोकस ओनली ऑन देम, देयर इज नो नीड ऑफ फोकसिंग ऑन other things, right? So while doing the sources, we'll keep in mind, because sources is a very vast topic, and let me give you the clarity, when it comes to sources, like there are certain topics like which can be done by us only while doing that particular topic, such as, let me give you one example, Arthashastra, which is falling in the category of secular sources. But then of course we cannot understand them, or we cannot cover this particular topic here, but the moment we'll start the Mauryan Empire, first we'll cover Arthashastra, that is how we cover. लेकिन हाँ, कुछ literary sources और archaeological sources as a whole जो है हम नहीं पढ़ते कहीं पे, और तो उसको हम यहाँ पे खत्म करेंगे, right? So let's talk about the literary sources and the archaeological sources. अच्छा, one more thing that's again very important before I come to the Brahmanical sources. If I'll ask this question to you, that once it is about Indian history writing, what do you think, that what sort of sources must be given more preference while writing the history, Indian history, archaeological or the literary?
So both are equally weightage, and both of them have equal weightage. Like if you consider the previous history, like before the literary sources, archaeological sources is the main.
Okay, fine. I'm changing my question now. ठीक है. अच्छा, you just tell me which one is easier, मतलब whether to use the archaeological sources or the literary sources while writing history? Easier.
Archaeological sources.
Very nice. आप सब भी ऐसा ही सोचते हो? नहीं, आपको क्या लगता है? लिटरेरी सोर्सेज आसान है?
Literary sources is easier. Archaeological sources can be used to cross-check the information.
आप तेज दौड़ रहे हैं? नहीं, बात तो सही की इसने। यार बहुत सिंपल सा आंसर है इसका। ऑफ कोर्स इट इज ईजियर टू यूज द लिटरेरी सोर्सेस। Suppose in the excavation you found this, so what next? What next? It's a process. अगर कोई बायोलॉजिकल चीज़ है तो आप उसको लैब में भेजेंगे, ठीक है, कितने साल पुराना है, किस किस चीज़ों से बना हुआ है, क्या था ये एग्जैक्टली. So you have to go for multiple, you have to wait for a longer period of time. And of course the moment you have been using the archaeological sources, there is greater use of science while using the archaeological sources. But when you have been consulting the literary sources, at that point of time you don't need to do anything. You have just found something in a written format and you need to interpret it and you can write it. Right? So the point is that when it comes to Indian history, so it was started by whom? The Britishers. The earliest history of India was written by Britishers. Now this may be subjective. अब के केस में ज़्यादा subjective है. क्यों? क्योंकि like this is really a problematic question that whether the earliest history was written by Britishers or not. But then what is to be noted here, कि if we'll go for the definition of history which is being followed by us right now, in that case definitely there were Britishers who have written the history of India for the first time. But when they had been writing the history of India under the banner of Asiatic societies, right, and it was done by the Orientalist people, you also keep in mind one thing, कि they were not, they were not going to put much effort in order to write the Indian history. कोई इतनी मशक्कत क्यों करेगा भाई Indian history लिखने के लिए? That's the reason, because of what? And in fact, like at that point of time, there was no archaeological survey of India. Because when it comes to the archaeological sources, it's mostly being excavated by ASI. At that point of time, it was only ASI. Recently, some more universities are there, such as the Deccan College of Pune is there, then BHU is there. Okay? There are certain good institutions of the colleges or the universities are there, which are also working in archaeology. But then at that point of time, ASI was the only institution. But then, can you tell me that what was the year when the ASI was constituted? Anybody? Acha, who was the founder of ASI? फॉरेनर ही होगा. सही कह रहे हैं. 1870s में जाके जो है कनिंघम ने फॉर्म किया था, अलेक्जेंडर कनिंघम. और अलेक्जेंडर कनिंघम ने जब इसको फॉर्म किया था, सो इट वाज हिज ओन एफर्ट बिकॉज ऑफ व्हाट ASI गॉट एस्टैब्लिश्ड एंड द मोमेंट दिस पर्सन डाइड ASI also was shut down. And again it was revived in 1904 when this like ASI is again becoming functional. After that it never got closed, it continued from then. So इसका मतलब archaeological sources तो थी ही नहीं उस समय. So that's why the history which was written by the Britishers, which is known by you as the Orientalist history or the British history, right? It's mostly written on the basis of literary sources. And as I have already told you that it is always easier to write the history on the basis of that. आज भी मान लीजिए आप PhD कर रहे हैं, ठीक है, और आपके पास दो चॉइसेस है. अगर आप एंशिएंट इंडिया में PhD कर रहे थे, आप एंशिएंट इंडिया में PhD कर रहे हैं, तो फिर क्या होगा कि जो है आपको एक आपके सामने आर्कियोलॉजिकल सोर्सेज है और लिटरेरी सोर्सेज है. तो अगर आपको PhD जल्दी ख़त्म करनी है तो आप थोड़ी ना उसको लैब में भेजेंगे टेस्ट के लिए, और बहुत सारी कॉम्प्लिकेशंस है. मेरा एक दोस्त था अलीगढ़ में, वो PhD कर रहा था अपनी, और वो PhD कर रहा था अलीगढ़ के मॉन्यूमेंट्स के ऊपर में, कुछ इस्लामिक जो मॉन्यूमेंट्स है वहाँ पे. तो एक दिन बेचारा गया जो है वो अपना मॉन्यूमेंट्स के मेजरमेंट के लिए कि कितनी लंबाई है कितनी चौड़ाई है. तो यूजुअली क्या होता है कि जो है मॉन्यूमेंट्स के आसपास लोग घर बना लेते हैं, वहाँ पे भी मॉन्यूमेंट्स के आसपास घर बने हुए थे. तो जब ये बहुत स्टाइल से जो है सनग्लास लगा के जो है वो गया एक दोस्त को लेके कि नापते हैं इसकी लंबाई कितनी है चौड़ाई कितनी है सारी, तो लोगों को लगा कोई सरकारी डिपार्टमेंट से आया है और इनको खाली करवाने के लिए बोलेगा, क्योंकि जो है वो है एक मॉन्यूमेंट है. लोगों ने घर से डंडा निकाला था. ये सही, मैं मजाक नहीं कर रहा हूँ, इट रियली हैपेंड. It really happened. So next time then he went with the permission कि नहीं I'm not from any government department, I'm just doing the research on this. Then only he was allowed to do all these measurements and all. So I hope you're getting my point. Using archaeological sources is now never that easy, and that's the reason because of what mostly it had been avoided, and literary sources had been given more preference. That is one of the lacuna in Indian history writing that you always keep in mind. Of course, when ASI is coming, ASI started working, but still there are so many limitations with ASI. ASI does not have great amount of money, or the government is not giving great amount of money to ASI to go for so many such hunts. Limitation is science is of course one reason because of what the uses of archaeological sources are limited in Indian context. But ऐसा भी नहीं कि हम बिल्कुल इस्तेमाल नहीं कर रहे. ठीक है, of course we have started using it, and yes, you are correct that what is the best way of incorporating the sources. If we have been using, if both sort of sources are available and we are incorporating both sort of sources, that would be the best history undoubtedly. But then of course limitations are there, and that's the reason because of what we have to keep in mind certain things. Anyways, we'll discuss, we'll bring back this topic while writing the conclusion. I'll just tell you that if you have been writing the conclusion, how come in this particular topic, how to frame a conclusion. In fact, sources का एक ऐसा topic है जिसमें आप pre-planned जो है उसके in fact हर topic में होता है यार कि आपके दिमाग में कुछ pre-conceived जो है ideas होते हैं, and you can frame the whole, let's say what to say, you can frame the whole answer on the basis of that. खासकर introduction कंक्लूजन तो बिल्कुल भी. तो हम हर टॉपिक के लिए अपने लिए एक जो है जनरलाइज कंक्लूजन बनाएंगे. तो अगर सिंपल क्वेश्चन आता है तो विदाउट थिंकिंग वी हैव टू राइट दैट इंट्रोडक्शन एंड कंक्लूजन. दैट विल डेफिनेटली मेक. बट बिफोर दैट सो आई थिंक देयर आर कपल ऑफ थिंग्स दैट यू शुड कीप इन माइंड. दैट सोर्सेज आर अनडाउटेडली इंपॉर्टेंट, बट देन इन इंडियन हिस्ट्री देयर इज अ lacuna that we have been relying more on the literary sources, and this particular tradition yet continues, though we are trying to change. But maybe it is going to 50 more years to change completely. Then only we'll be having a sort of complete use of the archaeological sources what we are having, right? But here it's like that only. That is one thing. And now moving to the the second thing that I did tell you, that the second thing that in GS sources as a topic will be studied in a very different way. In optional we are going to study it in a very different way. Okay? So we are going to start one by one with the sources. How we are going to do it, let me also tell you. We are going to first talk about we are going to start from here. So we'll cover the Brahminical sources, Buddhist sources, the Jain sources, and then we will see religious sources as a whole. Then we'll come to the secular sources, and secular sources में अभी हम क्या करने वाले हैं, we are going to focus more on the foreign accounts, because this topic we are going to cover here only. ठीक है, foreign accounts will cover. When it comes to these sort of sources, तो ये हम कहाँ पे cover करेंगे, ये हम cover करेंगे जब independent topics आएगा. तो उन independent topics के साथ, जैसे अब हम हर्षा कर रहे हैं तो हर्ष चरित्र के बारे में तब बात कर लेंगे. अभी cover करना बहुत मुश्किल होगा और हम बहुत ज़्यादा समझ भी नहीं पाएंगे उसको, right? and then of course archaeological sources will cover in this particular process, in this journey, like right now only. So basically one by one we are going to start start understanding all these subjects. So first of all, let's have a sort of brief idea of the Brahminical sources, and then we'll try to understand it as a whole also, right? So when it comes to the Brahminical sources, so what sort of texts are falling in the category of Brahminical sources? You all must have heard of like Shruti and Smriti literature. ये सब चीज़ें जो है आप सब मेरे हिसाब से अगर NCERT आपने पढ़ा है तो इन दैट केस वी मस्ट बी नोइंग अबाउट दीज काइंड ऑफ थिंग्स, ठीक है. सो व्हाट कलर शुड आई टेक? आई ब्लू ले लेते हैं, ठीक है. ओके, सो इट्स Shruti literature and Smriti literature, right? So when it comes to the Shruti literature, why it's being called as Shruti? Because this passed from one generation to next generation through the oral tradition. These are those texts that were not being written down or compiled during the time of its creation. They are called as Shruti literature. I hope it's clear to you. And there are different kind of ideas have been given for it. At one point of time, it is being said that it was being said. Basically, we can say that there is a there's a theoretical perception for this. That since these were the words of God directly, and that's why they could not be compiled. तो हमने क्या किया? हमने उसको कभी कंपाइल किया नहीं, जो बाद में जाके कंपाइल होते हैं. But then what the other scholars are saying कि actually these people did not know how to write Sanskrit, where Sanskrit was merely a dialect. और जो डायलेक्ट होती है वो बोलचाल की भाषा होती है. हमें लिखने के लिए क्या चाहिए? स्क्रिप्ट. दैट यू ऑलवेज कीप इन माइंड. फॉर राइटिंग एनीथिंग व्हाट डू वी नीड? स्क्रिप्ट. विदाउट स्क्रिप्ट वी कैन नॉट राइट एनीथिंग. Sanskrit was merely a dialect. Now it is again a controversial idea. ठीक है. There are some scholars, like in the current scenario, they have started believing Sanskrit is the original language of India, and in fact since beginning we knew how to write Sanskrit. बट अभी ठीक है, इसको थोड़ा वक्त लगेगा प्रूव होने में. हम जो स्टैब्लिश आइडियाज़ है उनको हम लेके चलेंगे. तो श्रुति लिटरेचर के अंदर वो सारी लिटरेचर आती है जो कंपोज तो बहुत पहले हो गई लेकिन कंपाइल नहीं हो पाई, ठीक है. सो कंपाइल उनका कंपाइलेशन काफ़ी बाद में होता है. और जो श्रुति लिटरेचर है दैट पास फ्रॉम वन जनरेशन टू नेक्स्ट जनरेशन थ्रू द ओरल ट्रेडिशन. उसका एक बड़ा सिंपल सा एग्जाम्पल मैं देता हूँ आपको. आपने पुराने टीवी सीरियल्स देखे होंगे जिसमें जो है गुरुकुल दिखाते हैं. In Gurukul, you won't find anybody sitting with a pen paper तो खैर आता था नहीं, but anything for writing. Tamrapatra is also coming pretty late. Only after the Gupta period you start finding the Tamrapatra, or during the Gupta period. उससे पहले ताम्रपत्र भी नहीं होते थे, तो कहीं लिखे हुए नहीं थे. वो टीचर जो है, जो भी गुरु होते थे, वो गुरु एक ऊंची चट जो है स्टोन पे बैठे होते थे और वो कुछ बोलते थे और लोग जो है उसके जो चिल्ड्रन होते थे या फिर जो स्टूडेंट्स होते थे वो उसको रट्टा मारते थे. दे यूज्ड टू क्रैम इट, दे ट्राइड टू क्रैम इट. चैंटिंग जिसको आप कहते हैं. तो दैट वाज द वे ऑफ स्टडी. एंड योर स्कॉलरशिप वाज डिपेंडिंग ऑन दिस फैक्ट दैट हाउ मेनी वेदास और हाउ मेनी लिटरेचर यू कैन रिमेंबर. आपने अगर एक वेद याद कर लिया तो आप छोटे स्कॉलर, 2 कर लिया तो बड़े स्कॉलर, 3 कर लिया और बड़े स्कॉलर, 4 वेदास याद कर लिए तो बहुत बड़े वेद. वेदी, द्विवेदी, त्रिवेदी, चतुर्वेदी, राइट. तो इसके ऊपर डिपेंड करता था. सो बेसिकली दे आर नॉट इन ए रिटन फॉर्मेट, so that's why they are being called as Shruti literature. So how you are going to write it? That this is that genre of literature which passed on from one generation to next generation through the oral tradition. Oral tradition, that's why we call it Shruti literature. सुन के जो पास हुए उसको हम श्रुति लिटरेचर कहते हैं, ऐसा हम मानते हैं, ठीक है. अब श्रुति लिटरेचर के अंदर what are the literature which are falling in the category of that's Shruti literature. So first of all, in Shruti, in this particular category we can write the Vedas, then Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and then Upanishads. Correct? So Vedas, Brahmins, Aranyakas and Upanishads. When it comes to the Smriti literature, in this particular category, there are some other sort of literature which are there, and among them, the most important epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata. Then the another important text which are falling in this category is Puranas, right? Then the next is Dharma Shastras. Now Dharma Shastra is basically Dharma, Sutras and Smritis. The Dharma Sutras and Smritis.
written down form और एक दोनों written down form थे.
कौन?
धर्मसूत्रा और स्मृति.
No, I simply said Dharma Shastras are basically it's constituted by Dharma Sutras and Smritis. ठीक है? Smriti is a text here, and here the Smriti is a genre of literature. Right? It's a classification. तो ये कोई original text नहीं. This is a text. You must have heard of Narad Smriti, Brihaspati Smriti, Katyan, and so on. ठीक है? So this is a like Smritis. Okay? Dharma Sutras, and then there are two more. There we can talk about basically the Upangas. What exactly am I? That's basically Upavedas, right? And the last one is Vedangas. The last one is Vedangas. Okay? So these are Shruti literature. There we have been talking about Vedas. There are 4 Vedas. Everybody must be knowing. Rig Veda, Sam Veda, Yajur Veda, Athar Veda. Right? Then it comes to Brahmins. Okay? It's again a kind of literature. It's a genre of literature. What kind of literature it is, I'll come to that. Then it's Aranyakas, Upanishads, they're falling in the Shruti category, right? I hope you got the meaning. They were not written from at the time of its being, like the time when it's being composed. And then it comes to the Smriti literature. So basically you talk about epics. These are 2 epics which are very popular under the Vedic tradition, I'm telling you. And these are Ramayana and Mahabharata. Then it comes to Puranas, right? And what sort of literature is there? Puranas, of course, we'll discuss. Then Dharma Shastra is there, which is constituted by Dharma Sutras and Smritis. And then finally it comes to Upavedas and Vedangas. These are the literature. Now again, I'll say the same thing, that if you are really preparing history as an optional paper, in that case, you just tell me if you have really done something, if you have worked on this, in that case, from where you can really find the possibility of the questions. Now I have given you all the list. Now you tell me honestly by using your wisdom कि कहाँ से possibility है questions की? Epics से, ठीक है? चलिए, आपकी बात हम थोड़ा सुन लेते हैं. So you believe that yes, from here the possibility of question is there. Epics. Puranas. नहीं आएगा. मतलब here I am discussing about the text as a source. Keep in mind. ठीक है? Here I am discussing about the text as a source, right? So Vedas, epics, Puranas. There's one thing that you guys are missing from here again, the possibility of question. Frankly speaking, you don't need to know everything. Like there are possibilities of questions from only these topics. And I must tell you very frankly that when it comes to the questions, like so far the questions were not asked from Vedas. You haven't seen a single question. Yes, from Dharma Shastra also the questions are not being asked. अभी तक जितने questions इन लोगों ने पूछे हैं, उन लोगों ने कहाँ से पूछे हैं? Epics and Puranas. that is called as Itihasa Purana tradition. They have asked questions, at least in last 10 years, twice or thrice they have asked questions on this particular topic. But then again, I am just telling you that yes, the possibility of the question is there from these topics also. Yeah, these topics also, that's called as Vedas. In future, it's going to become very important, right? And then, like, of course, Dharma Shastra, which was not asked so far, but yes, in future you can definitely expect a question from these topics also. तो हम बाकी पे बहुत मशक्कत करेंगे भी नहीं, ठीक है, क्योंकि वहाँ से क्वेश्चंस फ्रेम हो नहीं सकते हैं और वो मैं लिख के दे सकता हूँ. I can give you this in written format कि they cannot ask this question because I know that what is the content available on them. जाहिर सी बात है, हमें बनना भी नहीं है, हमें वही देखना है जहाँ से हमारे लिए questions possible है, ठीक है. Apart from this, there is a possibility of a question directly from here, that how come the Brahminical sources are helpful in writing history? What are the positives of Brahminical sources? What are the negatives of Brahminical sources? So as a whole, the question can be framed like that. ठीक है. So मुझे लगता है कि अगर हमारे पास इनके ऊपर information है, so it's quite easy for us to write the like Now the second thing which is very important, again when it comes to the Brahminical sources as a source of history, right? Any one of them hardly matters. Like how to understand it, we have to understand it in this way, that what are the information that we have been drawing from these sources and what are the lacunas or the negative points. कितने वेदास हैं, उसके अंदर कितने जो है हिम्स लिखे हुए हैं, ठीक है, उसमें कौन से हिम्स किसने लिखे, आपको लगता है कि इन्फॉर्मेशन आपके लिए इंपॉर्टेंट है? नहीं, क्योंकि आप जब हिस्ट्री पढ़ते हैं ना, बहुत बड़ी प्रॉब्लम है. इनफैक्ट ये प्रॉब्लम पता नहीं आप लोगों के साथ है या नहीं है, बट जब मैंने हिस्ट्री पढ़ी, आई वॉज ऑल्सो ए साइंस स्टूडेंट, ठीक है, till 10+2 I had science. So when I switched to history, because I could not handle chemistry, physics and maths I was always good. I'm still good with physics and maths. अभी भी आप 10+2 वाले को बोलोगे मैं पढ़ाऊंगा, ठीक है. तो प्रॉब्लम क्या थी उसमें कि उसमें जो है मैं जब हिस्ट्री में स्विच किया तो सबसे जब हम शुरुआत करते हैं तो हिस्टोरिकल फैक्ट सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट लगते हैं और हम क्या करते हैं, फैक्ट्स क्यों रटे जाते हैं, उनको एक जगह कंपाइल करके नोट्स बना लेते हैं. मैंने आई ऑल्सो अप्रोच टू माई सीनियर्स एंड सम टीचर्स ऑल्सो, दे सेड कि लाइक एनसीईआरटी के नोट्स बनाओ. आई स्टार्टेड मेकिंग द नोट्स ऑफ एनसीईआरटी. वो एनसीईआरटी का नोट जो है एनसीईआरटी से ज़्यादा बल्कि हो गया. So understand these kind of things since beginning कि where exactly, there should be a very clear thing in your mind कि whether you can write this in your exam paper or not. And if you believe कि ये कहीं यूज नहीं हो सकता है, मत पढ़ो यार उसको. बस इतना सा सेंस डेवलप करना है कि क्या आप कहीं लिख सकते हैं. Anywhere you can use this information, and the moment you feel that you cannot use this information anywhere, don't go for this information. छोड़ दो उसको, कूड़ा है आपके लिए वो. मे भी हो सकता है वो प्री के लिए इंपॉर्टेंट है, बट आई एम नॉट रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर योर प्री. वो आप देखिए, आई एम रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर ओनली द ऑप्शन. तो यहाँ पे ध्यान रखना. तो हमें बहुत फैक्चुअली नहीं जाना है. आपसे क्या क्वेश्चन पूछ सकता है कि टेल लाइक राइट द सिग्निफिकेंस ऑफ वेदास एज ए सोर्स ऑफ हिस्ट्री, यही पूछ सकते हैं ना. तो हमें इसके पॉजिटिव्स देखने, नेगेटिव्स देखने. दैट्स हाउ वी आर सपोज्ड टू डू इट. So you just be very clear that how we are going to cover it. So we are going to discuss first one by one the important sources here, and then we'll come to here. एक एक करके हम कवर करते हैं. First source for us is Vedas. When it comes to like the various things, ठीक है, various topics what we are going to cover, like always try to make you understand conceptually that you are having the conceptual ideas. And if you're having the conceptual idea, in that case, like any sort of twisted question is there, you'll be able to answer it. So if it is history, don't try to understand in this way, okay, it is history and everything will be there in a PDF, and that's why I'll read it from there and I'll try to like cram them and I'll try to produce them in the answer script. That's not possible. तो ये जो concept होता है कि PDF है, यहाँ पे मैंने PDF में ऐसे ऐसे करके बता दिया कि ये PDF है, देख लो, हो गया, वो टॉपिक खत्म हो गया. So I do not do in this way. ठीक है, मैं हमेशा हर टॉपिक को conceptually एक बार बात करूँगा उसके ऊपर, और उनके जो आइडियाज़ हैं, कोर आइडियाज़ हैं जो एक्चुअली आंसर में लिखने वाले हैं हम, that I'm going to dictate you. This is how like we are going to proceed. Now coming to the Vedas. Now when it comes to Vedas, you all know that there are 4 Vedas, and these Vedas are Rig Veda, Sam Veda, Yajur Veda and Atharva Veda, right? ये तो सबको पता होगा. 4 Vedas. In the current scenario, there is a different discourse going on. And in that particular discourse, like there are some recent scholars, they have been refusing to consider Atharva Veda as a Veda. ये बड़ा पॉपुलर डिस्कोर्स है और इनफैक्ट बड़ा इन्फ्लुएंशियल डिस्कोर्स है जो आजकल चल रहा है कि क्या हमें अथर्व वेदा को वाकई वेदा काउंट करना चाहिए या नहीं, बिकॉज दिस इज द ओनली वेदा विच इज कंसिडर्ड एज नॉन आर्यन वेदा. इट्स बीइंग कॉल्ड एज नॉन आर्यन वेदा, and that's how this discourse is there. We'll talk about that also later on, right? So basically when it comes to these 4 Vedas, and we have to understand it basically with respect to like the same question. So when it comes to Rig Veda, what exactly is written in Rig Veda? So in Rig Veda you can find the collection of what? The collection of hymns. There are 1028 hymns or 27, somewhere it is written 27, 1028, ठीक है, 1028, कहीं कहीं पे 1027 भी लिखा होता है. इतने हिम्स जो है इसके अंदर है और इन हिम्स में है क्या? बेसिकली दीज हिम्स आर डेडिकेटेड टू ए गॉड. So it is clearly visible from it कि if you have been really reading it or if you've been really reading it, in that case you'll be able to understand कि through these hymns like it has been tried to make the God happy. And as I told you that these hymns are dedicated to a particular God. And the gods were also classified in various categories that we'll discuss in the Vedic period. But then these hymns are dedicated to the gods, and the effort is there to make the god happy by chanting these hymns. That is the simple thing which is there in Rig Veda. When it comes to Sam Veda, in Sam Veda you can find that most of the hymns were repeated from the Rig Veda. But then what is the specification of Sam Veda? So specification of Sam Veda is basically the here like a new concept is being being brought here, that the music is associated here. Matlab, when it comes to Rig Veda, chanting of hymn was not limited. It was not confined in any particular boundary. The way you want to sing it, the way you want to chant it, you are free to do it. But in Sam Veda, there is a limitation, there is a restriction that only those who could sing it in a proper way, proper tone, they are allowed to sing it. Otherwise, people were not allowed to chant it chant it. Then when it comes to Yajur Veda, now what is the significance of Yajur Veda? Now again,
process of ritual.
Exactly. You'll find the repetition of the hymns even in Yajur Veda, but then here the rituals were also simultaneously associated. These are the significances of these 3 Vedas, but ultimately you find the repetition of same hymns here. And when it comes to Atharva Veda, I have already told you that there is a dividing line between these 2, and it's considered as non-Aryan Veda. It's considered as non-Aryan Veda. So here hymns repeated in Sam Veda, but one sort of specification or specialization was added that you need to chant it in a proper musical tone. That's Sam Veda. Yajur Veda, there you can find the association of certain rituals while chanting the hymns. It's not paranormal activities, it's black magics. Black magics. है ना? It's black magic. ठीक है? तो यहाँ पे ये 4 जो है वेदास है. अब फिर से मैं वही कहूँगा, हमारे लिए क्वेश्चन क्या है कि हाउ कम द वेदास आर हेल्पिंग अस टू राइट द हिस्ट्री. That's the most important question. So there are a couple of things that you have to keep in mind while studying the Vedas, that ultimately which is the period in which the Vedas were being composed. It is the Vedic period. Vedic period. And it is believed that majority of the part of the Rig Veda was composed in which particular period? Early Vedic period. The majorly it is composed in early Vedic period, right? And the parts which is from second to 7th, ठीक है? The parts which is 2nd to 7th, these are considered to be the originally from early Vedic period, and that's how they are being called as family books. These are called as family books. So what about rest of the parts? there are certain sections of Rig Veda were already borrowed from outside. We believe, as per the current scenario, we believe that some of the parts of it were borrowed from outside, whether the some parts of Rig Veda were developed later on. So first, then 8th, 9th and 10th, these are the later editions in Rig Veda, and that's why we do not believe that except this, the sections, except the family books are really helping us to write the history of early Vedic period. Like for early Vedic period, we have been referring only from 2nd to 7th. And rest of the parts we have been using for later Vedic period because they were the later editions, and that's how we have been using it for the later Vedic period. And the best example for this would be basically the Purush Sukt, which is there in the 10th mandala of Rig Veda. That is giving the earliest discussion on the Varna, right, the Chatur Varna system, that is there in 10th mandala, and that's why we believe that the Varna system did not evolve in the Rig Vedic period, rather it evolved in which period? Later Vedic period. So that is the whole idea. Correct. Rest of the two Vedas, in fact I'll say rest of the three Vedas, if for the time being we are considering Athar Veda as a Veda, were developed in which particular period? The later Vedic period. Later Vedic period. They were developed in later Vedic period, and that's why they are giving us information about this. Sorry? Later Vedic period. And Athar Veda, which is considered to be a non-Aryan Veda, it's dealing with very different kind of concept. In Athar Veda, you won't find the repetition of hymns, you won't find the same concept are being dealt here, you won't find the repetition of the gods, because here you'll find the repetition of the same gods here as well, from Sam Rig Veda to Sam Veda to Yajur Veda. Here you do not find the references of all those gods. Rather, here the very different kind of things are discussed. So what are there in the Athar Veda? So some certain indigenous traditions have been discussed in Athar Veda, such as the black magic is there, amulet is there, and all these kind of things have been discussed in Athar Veda. Okay. Now coming to the most important point, that how come the Vedas as a source of history being used by us? So I'm just giving this heading, the Vedas as source of history. Vedas as source of history, correct? Now, whenever you have been using the Vedas as a source of history, it is helping us to identify, or let's say write the history of various things. Okay? The first topic I'll say that we are able to write the polity of early Vedic period and later Vedic period. In fact, we are getting the chance to do a comparative study of early Vedic polity and the later Vedic polity. Now, I am not getting much into this, but then I am briefly telling you, such as in the early Vedic period, what do you say? That what sort of polity is there? It's a kinship polity, right? In early Vedic period, you say that it is kinship polity, but the moment you go to the later Vedic period, we say ki what sort of polity was there? It was the chiefdom. Can we talk about any other source which is giving or which are giving these kind of information? No. That we do come across with the help of the Vedas only. Okay? So what is kinship and what is chiefdom? I'll make you understand, of course, in the later classes. But then this is the transition. Kinship mein kya hota hai? Kinship mein basically there is no political powers required. As kinship matlab everybody is sharing some sort of blood relationship. And whenever you have been sharing a blood relationship, actually you do not require any king or any chief. In your family, I always used to say, in your family nobody is considered as a king or chief. आप हेडमैन कह सकते हैं, बट यू डू नॉट कॉल योर फादर एज चीफ और योर ग्रैंडफादर एज चीफ. जैसे ही फादर जो है इंटर करते हैं घर के अंदर, आप में से भाई बहनों में से कोई खड़े होकर नहीं बोलता है कि सावधान महाराजा सो एंड सो जिले इलाही और एक्सेट्रा एक्सेट्रा. entering into the house. हाँ, ये होता है कि जैसे ही the head of the family is entering, आप सब जो है टीवी देख रहे थे, टीवी बंद करके पढ़ने बैठ जाते हैं. ये मैक्सिमम हो सकता है. तो उनके लिए राजमुकुट या इनकोरोनेशन की जरूरी नहीं, इनकोरोनेशन नहीं चाहिए, है ना. चीजें कैसे कंट्रोल हो रही है? दैट पर्सन इज कंसिडर्ड एज द हेड ऑफ फैमिली. व्हाई? ही इज द फादर, ही इज ग्रैंडफादर, व्हाटएवर, लाइक ही इज. ही मैं बार बार इस्तेमाल कर रहा हूं क्योंकि हम एंशिएंट इंडिया की बात कर रहे हैं. पुरुष प्रधान समाज, पेट्रियार्कल सोसाइटी. So basically what happens, like it's a kinship society. So here the relations basically is controlling everything, and that's how there was no polity required. But then yes, there was a sort of polity, what we're going to discuss about the various institutions like Sabha, Samiti, Vidat and Gan, that who was the person who was considered as the head, like what was the requirement of this, like all these things we'll discuss in the Vedic polity. But right now I'm telling you that about this particular transition which you do come across through the sources, through the Vedas only. Moving to the second thing, so here we can talk about basically economy. First of all, let's talk about economy. Now again in economy you find a transition. And what sort of transition? Here what sort of economy is there? It's pastoralist economy. And the moment you go to the later Vedic period, what sort of economy you find? Here you find the agriculturist economy. And how do you say this? Because when you talk about early Vedic period, like do you all know that the maximum preference has been given to one word, that is Gau? So cow was given the maximum preference. On the other hand, we find very less discussion on agricultural activities, the agricultural tools and so on. And that's why we say that this economy must not be an agrarian economy. So this is like, since they had been giving due importance to the cow, to the cows or cattle, and that's why we call it pastoralist economy. But the moment we go to the later Vedic period, here we start finding the discussions on basically the various agricultural activities. Atharva Veda is that Veda which is extensively giving discussion about what? There's giving discussion about the various processes of agriculture. That in fact it does talk about 4 important stages of agriculture which is categorically given in Atharva Veda. It is also simultaneously talking about the various tools which were being used for the agricultural works. On the other hand, there is another important text, let's call it Satpat Brahmin, which is also considered from the later Vedic period. Now that is also talking about the various processes of agriculture. And again there is a story of Bideh Madhav, which is considered to be the most important one, which is categorically dealing with what? Dealing with the process of agriculture. It talks about a person who has donated a land, and this person is a Brahmin. Bideh Madhav is getting into this land, and then he realizes that this particular place is, or this particular land is full of forest and then bushes and shrubs. Then he thought of clearing this land, and he puts that particular land on fire, and that's how he is converting the land into a cultivable land. This is a process. And apart from this also, various agricultural processes have been discussed in Satpat Brahmin. Anyways, here we are not discussing about the Brahmins, but then I am giving you the example through which we can prove कि yes, and that's how we can use the example. I hope you got my point. अगर यही हम लिखते कि भाई यहाँ से अर्ली वैदिक से लेटर वैदिक में कैसा ट्रांजिशन हो रहा है, पैस्टरलिस्ट से एग्रीकल्चरिस्ट बन रहे हैं, इसी चीज़ को अगर हम ऐसे लिखते हैं कि from Atharva Veda and Satpat Brahmin we come across, or we find the various references of the agricultural activities in these two texts, which proves that agriculture had become significant or more important to them, and then pastoralism somehow became the secondary economic activities. So this economic transition we do come across through what? We do come across through the Vedas only, right? Then third is about the society. Now again in society you find a transition. And this transition can be, right now, can be written by me simply in a way that it is a simple society, and we move to a what sort of society? A complex society. A simple society, that was ये question UPSC ने पूछा भी है. Egalitarian society. What sort of society it was? Egalitarian society. Egalitarian, basically there was no hierarchy in the society. And again, when it comes to hierarchy, there are two types of hierarchy. One is the class hierarchy and one is the social hierarchy. So neither the Varna system was present. That means that the social hierarchy was not present or social differences were not present in this particular society. And then the class hierarchy was also not present, and that's why we have been calling this society as simple and egalitarian society. And this question has been asked by UPSC that how come this egalitarian, or to what extent it is correct to call this Rigvedic society as an egalitarian society, because there are so many complexities were not here, but then these complexities do appear where in the later Vedic period. And the moment it appears, we categorically say that yes, the society has become complex in terms of Varna, Gotra and so on. And that's how we can say that society is also transforming transforming. Apart from this, we can talk about basically a very important aspect is gender. That could be taken as a part of society itself. Now when it comes to gender, so basically in the early Vedic period, what sort of gender relation we find? That, as I have already told you, that egalitarian society, and that's how the patriarchy you do not find very consolidated here, but the moment you go to the later Vedic period, you find the consolidation in the patriarchy. Again, this question has been asked twice in last 10 years by UPSC in twisted way. How come the patriarchy is getting consolidated from early Vedic to later Vedic period? And there are several reasons behind it. Of course, these are these are the things we are not discussing here. हम उसको Vedic period में discuss करेंगे. But ये जो patriarchy का relationship, तभी मैं कहता हूँ कि चीजें conceptually clear होनी चाहिए. फर्क नहीं पड़ता है कि आपने directly उसको पढ़ा या नहीं पढ़ा. If you haven't gone through that directly, even though at least you'll be having the ideas to write that answer, that's the most important thing. What you have to keep in mind. So the gender relationship is also changing, and then fifth, we can talk about a important change in the religion. Now again, I can say that religion used to be slightly simple here, and which is becoming complex in the later Vedic period. Now this you have to understand very carefully, that when you are calling this religion here simple here, what does that mean? And why am I calling the religion complex here? So there is a meaning behind, there is a logic behind it. As I have already told you that when it comes to early Vedic period, in early Vedic period, most of the information we have been getting through Rig Veda. And in Rig Veda, the certain hymns were there, and there was no restriction imposed over anyone for chanting the hymns. Anybody was free to chant the hymns. मुझे बेटा चाहिए, मैं एक खाली जगह पे गया, मैंने जोर जोर से hymns chant करना शुरू कर दिया, घर जाऊंगा बेटा मिल जाएगा. सार्कास्टिक है यार, ठीक है. But in later Vedic period, you find that there were so many specifications were associated with the chanting of hymns. Music compulsory हो गया. मतलब, of course, I am also a singer, right? But then I myself do not believe in my potential as a singer. बाथरूम के अंदर तो गा लूंगा, मुझे तो वहां से भी डर लगता है बाहर कोई सुन ना ले. तो मुझे अच्छा गाने के लिए क्या चाहिए? सेंस ऑफ म्यूजिक चाहिए. और अगर वो सेंस ऑफ म्यूजिक नहीं है तो मैं नहीं गा पाऊंगा, जाहिर सी बात है. अंदर कमरे में घुस के गा लूं अलग बात है, लेकिन बाहर नहीं गा सकता. तो सेंस ऑफ म्यूजिक बहुत जरूरी. इसका मतलब क्या है कि ऑल दोस पीपल हु हैड बीन ट्रेन्ड इन चैंटिंग इट, ओनली दे वर अलाउड टू चैंट इट. दोज हु आर नॉट ट्रेन्ड इन दिस, दे कुड नॉट डू इट. सो देयर वाज स्पेसिफिकेशन. अब मान लीजिए इतने सारे लोग हैं यहाँ पे, इतने सारे लोग में मुझे लगता है कि ये ट्रेनिंग सिर्फ 2 लोगों को मिली. इसका मतलब वही 2 लोग वही 2 लोग उसको चैन कर सकते हैं. तो बाकी लोग तो आइसोलेटेड हो गए. या 4 लोग हो गए मान लीजिए चैन करने के लिए, बाकी लोग तो आइसोलेटेड हो गए, बाकी लोग तो वो नहीं कर सकते. स्पेसिफिकेशन. एंड व्हाट डिड आई टेल यू फॉर द यजुर्वेदा? नाउ फर्दर स्पेसिफिकेशन हैज बीन एडेड. And what is that specification? Like simultaneously you need to perform certain rituals while chanting. It means that only the proper way of chanting is not going to get you your desired stuff. Rather, But what you are supposed to do while chanting the hymns in a proper musical tone, simultaneously you need to perform certain rituals, and then only you can expect of getting something what you had been actually desired of. और specifications कर दिया गया. अगर ये नहीं करते तो मतलब मैं इसका एक प्रैक्टिकल इम्प्लीकेशन बता रहा हूँ लोग शादी करने के लिए किसी को बुलाते नहीं, प्रीस्ट को खुद ही चैंट कर लेते हैं। फिर बोला नहीं ऐसा थोड़ी होगा यार, प्रॉपर टून में गाना पड़ेगा। बोले चलो ठीक है यार, ऑडियो प्ले कर दिया। तो फिर बोले ये तो इसका भी सोल्यूशन लोगों ने निकाल दिया, अब क्या करें? बोले नहीं, इसके साथ रिचुअल करना होगा। रिचुअल क्या? थोड़ी देर के बाद वो कहता है घी डालना है, फिर वो कहता है वो चावल डालना है, ये सारी चीज़ें डालनी है। तो पॉइंट ये है कि जब ये सारी चीज़ें डालनी कौन बताएगा हमें? तो वो बताएंगे, ठीक है। सो दैट्स व्हाई रिचुअल्स वर आल्सो एसोसिएटेड विद दिस। सो नाउ द कॉम्प्लेक्सिटीज विद देयर। अब देन व्हाट बिकम्स क्वेश्चन हियर, व्हाई? दैट इज द मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट क्वेश्चन। ठीक था ना, चीजें सिंपल थी, अच्छी थी, प्रॉब्लम क्या है उसमें? Now this is being associated with another great information that we do get, and that is about the geographical shift. When it comes to early Vedic period, in which particular region they were located? They were located in Sapt Sindhu area. But when we are going to the later Vedic period, they are coming to upper Gangetic plains. And most of the scholars believe that when they are moving towards the upper Gangetic plain, it is not simply a movement, or it is not simply a migration, rather it is the integration of the indigenous people into the Aryan culture. And when these two cultures are meeting, so of course one culture which is trying to somehow keep itself superior, and that's the reason because of what it started imposing all those restrictions over it. आप कैसे प्रूव करेंगे कि आप सुपीरियर हैं? तो उन्होंने रिस्ट्रिक्शंस लगाए। अब जो इंडिजिनस है, इंडिजिनस लोगों के लिए इतना आसान नहीं है कि वो उनको उस म्यूजिकल ट्रेनिंग उनको नहीं मिली, वो रिचुअल्स की ट्रेनिंग नहीं मिले, तो वो तो नहीं कर सकते हैं। So there was an integration between the Aryans and the non-Aryans, but then after this integration, since the Aryans desperately tried to keep them isolated from this process, and that's why they had started adding these specifications. Now this you can understand with another important thing that I have already discussed is about that Atharvaveda. What did I tell you? What is Atharvaveda? It's a non-Aryan Veda. But then it is also true that when you have been merging, or let's say when you are mingling with the non-Aryans, and then at the same time you are also desperately trying to keep them isolated or secluded from this tradition, in that case why would they merge with you? Why would they mingle with you? And that's why they had created another Veda that's called as Atharvaveda, and this Atharvaveda was said कि it is non-Aryan Veda, ये तुम लोगों का वेदा है, तुम लोग खुश रहो इसमें। ये तीन कौन से वेदास है? ये आर्यन वेदास है। तो इसका मतलब है कि we do come across about this what? About this geographical shift from this area to this area. I hope you got my point. That if this question is coming कि what sort of information we do get from the Vedas, these are the information that we have been getting. अब इसको we have already discussed the sources. Now what we are supposed to do? We have to merge it with certain historians. एक दो historians merge करेंगे और हमारा topic तैयार हो जाएगा कि how come we can extract information from the Vedas, right?